This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 471 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, I want to let you know that FanDuel Sportsbook is making sure you have the opportunity to get in on the action over Wildcard Weekend with some of the best possible odds on the market. Right now, new users can wager up to $5 on any team to win their Wildcard Divisional or Conference Championship game at plus 2,500 odds. That's right, a $5 bet on any team to win any game before the Super Bowl can win you $125. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app and make your first deposit to see the enhanced odds today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, West Virginia, Tennessee, Iowa, or Indiana. New users only. Must wager on designated boost market. Deposit required. Max bonus $125. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Tennessee, call Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789. The first question this week is from @Ikey What do you make of a top-heavy season with no offseason? And then he goes on to list some statistics. It says, in 2020, we had 9 1,000-yard rushers. In 2019, there were 16 of them. In 2020, we had 10 players with a minimum of 200 carries. In 2019, we had 20 players with a minimum of 200 carries. In 2020, we had 18 1,000-yard wide receivers, and 9 of them had 1,200 yards. In 2019, we had 29 1,000-yard receivers, but only 5 of them had 1,200 yards. So what does this all mean? That's what the question's asking. And honestly, I don't make much of it. I think this is a good example of why we should very rarely draw conclusions based on one season or one season versus the season that happened prior. For instance, you note that there were 9 1,000-yard rushers. There were 8 at running back, and then there was Lamar Jackson. In 2019, there were 16 of them. But in 2018, there were 9 of them. In 2017, there were also 9 of them. In 2016, there were 12. So if anything, it doesn't make 2020 look weird. It makes 2019 look weird, which we kind of knew. 2019 was a really good year for running backs, and it was a good year for drafting running backs early in fantasy football. If elite running backs are doing well and they're staying healthy, then there's a higher chance that more yards are going to singular players because those dominant running backs demand a larger workload. So there are a multitude of reasons that shifts like this can happen year over year. But I think it's always important to recognize when, first off, arbitrary cutoffs are being used. Because these are arbitrary cutoffs. But you need more of a sample to really push forth any sort of explanation. Like at a high level, given the scoring that we saw this year, you could at least offer up the idea that the lack of preseason and reps probably benefited offenses more than defenses. We saw that during the near lockout season about 10 years ago, especially at the start of the year. But a lot of individual player milestones within a really small snapshot, it can be explained by injury to top players and simple variance. I wouldn't think too much of it, especially since 2020 matches more closely with other seasons than 2019 did. If anything, 2019 is not the norm. It looks like more of the outlier. And we sort of knew that entering the year. This next question is from @Cincy_Valentine. What happened to Cam Newton? Felt like the 2020 version of 2019 Lamar Jackson. First couple of games were fire, then poof. Yeah, so I remember answering a question about Cam during the middle of the season, and my stance and outlook really remains the same. At the start of the season, when Cam was putting together really good fantasy performances, he was mostly doing it with rushing. He had 4 rushing touchdowns after 2 games, and he had 5 rushing touchdowns after 4 games. The hope then moving forward is that Cam would improve as a passer. He would get in a groove throwing the ball. And that would combat any regression that was coming on the ground. But that never happened. He actually got worse as a passer. So I think a couple of things were at play. Had he not had the rushing scores that he had to start the year, I doubt we would have ever had it in our head that Newton was going to be some beastly fantasy asset this year. I mean, aside from what we felt during the preseason and the upside that existed there. And keep in mind, the comparison to Lamar Jackson that you made, Jackson had an absurdly good passing year efficiency-wise in 2019, at least for fantasy purposes. I don't think that should have ever been in our range of outcomes for Cam Newton for a lot of reasons. And he didn't show that in week 1. He did have a good game against Seattle, but Seattle's defense was horrendous to start the year. But Cam was bound to regress as a rusher. And without the improvement as a passer, he turned into a less reliable fantasy asset. This next question is from @JPH_GSG. Do you do an autopsy on your teams that fail to meet expectations? I'm talking like a deep dive beyond just considering how transactions and spending were handled. If so, what do you look at to learn from for next season? I look back at all of my teams to see what went right and what went wrong. But yes, I definitely pay more attention to the teams that did poorly because that teaches you more. You learn more. I don't look at my teams that won fantasy titles that closely. Clearly, I did something right. But usually when I look back, the general theme as to why I lost is pretty obvious. In one league this year, for example, I was forced to stream quarterbacks. And I often didn't get the result that I wanted. I could have easily gone in the opposite direction with those quarterback choices because plenty of quarterbacks were available. But number 1, it was a tough year for quarterback streaming. Number 2, variance hit in the wrong way for me. That's going to happen. Sometimes there's a simple explanation though. I was 3rd in points in one league this year and I missed the playoffs. I lost 4 games by 2 or fewer points. And there wasn't a spot in the playoffs for most points not in, so I didn't get in. That type of bad luck happens. But I think overall, there are probably 2 big things to remember when you go through this exercise of understanding what went wrong in your leagues. One is whether or not you successfully strategized for the type of league structure that you were playing in. Sometimes you realize after the fact, man, this league really benefits having a stud quarterback. Sometimes you don't totally capture that when you're entering a draft, even if you think that you do. You have to embrace the fact that your strategy and what you're studying going into a draft, that might be wrong. The second thing, though, is that higher level trends, the stuff that I talk about on this show during the offseason, that's still going to help you with future drafts more than seeing that you picked up the wrong guy off the waiver wire one given week. Even if you're in 2 or 3 leagues, that's still a pretty small sample size. You should be looking at things at a macro level, not just the micro one. Even though looking at the micro one can still help you. Just don't lose sight of that macro level while you're picking off reasons as to why you lost. This next question is from @Stags2. How much do you think a new quarterback will help James Robinson, and how will that affect his draft position? So I think James Robinson is probably going to be one of the most polarizing players in fantasy football this offseason. You guys know that I'm a believer in him, the player. And I don't buy into this idea that his undrafted free agent status now makes him an obvious sell candidate. Because he's already proven that he's an outlier with what he did this year. But with that being said, Jacksonville is likely to get some running back help this offseason. They didn't have that much running back depth. And there's no way Robinson maintains the type of backfield share that he was seeing in year 1. Or at least it's going to be really hard for him to. Now, that doesn't automatically make him a sell. The market dictates whether you should sell a player or not. And to the point of the question, the market's going to dictate whether you should go after Robinson with a clear upgrade at quarterback. And yes, hypothetically, a new quarterback should help Robinson. But you're not gaining any sort of informational edge by knowing there's going to be an upgrade for Jacksonville. I would argue that backfield share regression could easily wipe out any sort of upgrade that we're going to see from Jacksonville at the quarterback position. That's not necessarily a bad thing because Robinson was a really good fantasy asset this year. I'm just saying that an upgrade at quarterback for James Robinson, that doesn't automatically mean that he's going to be a better fantasy asset in 2021. Because despite the crappy offense that he was in, he actually had it pretty good. Because volume drives so much in fantasy football. But the thing is, with this question, we're not going to know how a quarterback change will affect James Robinson's draft position. Because we don't know what his draft position is going to be before the quarterback upgrade. It's not like people are going into drafts thinking that Gardner Minshew is Jacksonville's quarterback moving forward. We know what's about to happen. We know there's like a 99% chance, probably even higher, that Trevor Lawrence is going to be Jacksonville's quarterback. Of course, something could change. Maybe he doesn't want to go to Jacksonville. Maybe he pulls an Eli Manning. But even still, Jacksonville is going to go after a quarterback. There's likely going to be a quarterback upgrade. But I think my answer to this question, if I were to sum it all up, is that if your expectation is Robinson can only get better because of a quarterback upgrade, I don't think that's right. Because even though he was good, and even though I very much have been a believer in James Robinson, the player, I have to recognize that his volume is going to be very hard to sustain. This next question is from @sfost0429. Biggest fraud of the season, aka who is someone who was top 10 extra points for top 5 this season at their position that won't be top 30 next season? Outside the top 30 in positional scoring, or I'm assuming this is positional scoring, that's kind of tough. That's a huge drop if we don't assume injury. I'm going to look at points per game for this question, and I'm going to look at players who played at least half of their team's games this year. And right there at RB10 in points per game is Myles Gaskin. I don't think Gaskin is bad. I just could see a path to the Dolphins bringing in another running back, even though I personally don't think that's a necessary thing to do. And that's how you immediately get bumped from being a top 10 guy when you're active to being more top 30, to being an RB3. At wide receiver, I think my answer would be Tyler Lockett. Wide receiver is really tough because the top 10 wide receivers this year are all really good. But even though the Seahawks are going to throw touchdowns at a higher than normal rate with Russell Wilson under center, it's not hard to see that Lockett could have been far, far worse this year without a couple of blow-up games. If those blow-up games don't happen, we don't get the same Tyler Lockett. And if touchdown variance isn't on his side this year, maybe he falls a bit. It's not like I'm going to rank him that low, but I could at least see it. This next question is an email from Mike, which, by the way, you can email me questions during the offseason for these mailbag shows. My email is jj@numberfire.com. But it says, "Hey, JJ, thanks for viewing this question. I remember seeing yards per team pass attempt as a new marker for prospects. Is this because it's a step closer to yards per route run, making it a closer indicator to production?" So I've been using yards per team pass attempt in my model for a few years now. And I actually use it with players in the NFL too. It doesn't really have anything to do with yards per route run though. There's just some predictive power to it because it sort of blends a lot of different metrics into one. Like, think about what this statistic is. Yards per team pass attempt. You're looking at cumulative yards, which is a volume statistic, and volume is sticky year over year. And you're relating it to a player's team. And that allows the metric to be sort of a market share one. And then it's also sort of an efficiency-based one because it's a fraction. Now, it's not flawless, but it's gotten signal in my models, and it's a big part of my models. And for the record, I'm not close to the person who came up with this. I know that some of the guys at RotoViz, they've been messing with this metric for years. And then Anthony Amico, who did a show with me a while back on prospecting through data, he uses it too. I just got around to messing around with it, and I saw its power. This last question is from @KSpearing8. Planning to start up a dynasty league this year. Does the late round quarterback strategy still apply there, or do you adjust for an anticipated shortage of streamers and lock down a multi-year starter earlier than you would in redraft/keeper? So the late round quarterback strategy really came about because of the number of usable quarterbacks that you could take late in drafts. But that stemmed from the supply and demand of the position. You only need one quarterback in most fantasy football leagues. So teams aren't typically reaching to get one. And there were always quarterbacks available late, usable quarterbacks. That fact doesn't totally change in a dynasty format. Yeah, you can't effectively stream, but you're also going to be rostering more quarterbacks. So you can get away with having a platoon rather than having a stud. Because remember, when you get a stud, there's an opportunity cost involved there. You're missing out on studs at running back and wide receiver. And those are more important positions for your team build. So the quick and dirty answer here is that yes, you can still wait. And honestly, sometimes it's more advantageous because people seem to think that because it's dynasty, you need to have this long-lasting quarterback. You need Kyler Murray. You need Joe Burrow. You need these guys who are going to be around for a really long time. But that's not true. You don't need a flawless team to win fantasy football championships. But because people think this way, it sometimes becomes even more advantageous to wait. Because those people are pushing down running back and wide receivers to better spots in drafts. So yes, still wait. You obviously still have to be reactive to what's going on so that you're not starting Sam Darnold every week. But there are a lot of good young quarterbacks in the league right now. There's no need to reach. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.